A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwath and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, this is just something that's kind of just been on my mind about the making of many books, and this was something that King Solomon, he spoke on. He spoke on this. This was a talking point, one of his talking points, and how much more to understand, the value of knowing and having those writings basically for our learning, right? And I guess I kind of want to couple this with experience too, with essentially the making of many books and some of the basically also the dangers of going into so many books because there's so many there's so many false doctrines floating around here, and there's basically a lot of gross darkness and things that people believe in, right? As the scriptures say, gross darkness, the people, right? And um this is not to shun the importance of studying and showing thyself approved, right? Because a lot of these books, as you see on the screen here, you have Babylon the Timbuktu. I've read this one. Who is Esau, Edom, and Roman Empire of the Edomite, right? So those two I have not read personally. The Babylon the Timbuktu, that was one I read, and it's a very good book. It basically goes really into the depth of the first, like it goes into certain things like the creation, the birth of what we know as Islam today, and how a lot of their tenets, their belief systems were taken from our people to create what they would call today certain of their high holy days like Ramadan. They took that, and that was loosely based off of one of our customs within our culture known as Day of Atonement, right? So that being said, there is a value in knowing some of the things that's written of within these different books, right? But I'm making this lesson because they can also, without knowing yourself and your flesh very well. As a matter of fact, I'll start off with this one. Since I said that. Where is it? Okay, this is 2 Corinthians 13 and 5. And it says, examine yourselves whether ye be in the faith, prove your own selves, know ye not your own selves, how that Hamashiach Yahushai is in you, except ye be reprobates. But I trust that ye shall know that we are not reprobates, right? So, through examination, you will know, and self-reflection, spending time with yourself, you would know that, okay, this is something that I really, really like to do, but let me pace myself, let me actually, become a lot more rooted, within my understanding of knowing my culture and who I am, and the breakdowns, from our apostles and elders on down, what I'm saying? Because for me, as myself, if you're a person kind of like myself, you know, speaking from experience, I dove, if that's a word, I went into a lot of books like constantly trying to tie it to prophecies, right? But didn't prioritize actually seeking, more understanding from the scriptures, right? So essentially you start to become more untempered, right? And other things can also creep in as well. So like, for example, like a chip on your shoulder, in becoming a lot more prideful, right? And the scriptures talk about how pride is not made for men. So I'm speaking, from experience. And now this is not to shun, you know, the information, if it to basically be tied in to certain prophecies within the Bible, right? Certain things that happen to us, Second Ezra 13, about the 10 tribes, Second Ezra 11 about the Roman Empire. When you know about, those different prophecies, and you're able to kind of tie those together, it can make you very, very knowledgeable and profitable, right? But this lesson is really to understand that, okay, if you're not too aware of your flesh and know some of the tendencies of your flesh, this is one of the things that can happen, right? So this is just basically just to be mindful of your flesh, when it comes to, essentially the making of many books, because like I said, there's so many like false doctrines of, out here, right? So let me get actually what King Solomon said, and, I sincerely, pray that this lesson would be edifying, right? So this is Ecclesiastes 12:12 and Amplified, and it says, "But beyond this, my son, about going further than words given by one shepherd, be warned, the writing of many books is endless. So do not believe everything you read. The excessive study and devotion to books is weary to the body." Right. So, in the KJV, it says there's much, it brings a weariness to the flesh, and that's true. Right. So you start to become very, weighed down. So that's why it's important to actually to be able to like go outside and, to be interactive, bodily exercise, you know what I'm saying? To make sure that you balance yourself out, that you're not too much of a hermit. You know what I'm saying? You got to do something, and actually reflect on what you read. But, this is one of the consequences of it basically going into many books, right? So, this is one thing I actually wanted to get as well. Let me go to Isaiah. Where is it? Isaiah. This is Isaiah 34, verse 16, and it says, "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord, and read. None of these shall fail, none of them shall want her mate. For my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit hath gathered them." So seek ye out of the book of the Lord. None of these things shall fail. None of these prophecies that's written thereof, shall fail. And that is one of the key things, that separates the scriptures from these other books, is prophecies. There's no prophecies contained, within these other books, right? The Bible doesn't need a support from these other books, but you can what these other books, what a lot of times when you read through a lot of these other books, they normally commonly reference things that are spoken of within the scriptures, right? So none of these prophecies, and prophecy is one of the biggest things that separates the Bible from a lot of these other books that are out here, right? So, and that's another thing too, something that I've observed, trying to strive to be more tempered, and which I'll get that in a second, is that the Lord will put us in situations, which is basically kind of like my second point, to exemplify certain fruits of the Spirit. And that is something that you don't get, within these other books. You don't get an understanding of like, okay, when you're in a particular situation, when you're in suffering from that affliction, you don't get that, essentially that comfort, within that those other books, right? Let me go here. Just bear with me. This is Matthew 7, verse 24, and it says, "Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man that built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, because, I'm sorry, for it was founded upon a rock, right? So, you know, those rain, the floods, the winds, and all those kind of stuff, the sand blowing and all this kind of stuff, that represents, you know, trials, tribulation, affliction, things that, that are actually being used to actually, test the quality, of your faith, right? And, when you think about it, that is something you can't get, within, these other books, because that's what the scriptures talk about, how the things are written aforetime are written for our learning, and learning the things that, what Yahushua did, what he went through, what certain of the different situations, the highs and lows that our forefathers went through. That is something you can't get, within, these other books. And again, this is not to shun the importance of knowing some of the information in these books, being essentially to be more well read and more very well studied. I'm not knocking the importance of that, right? This is not a lesson to knock the importance of that. It's just a lesson to understand that, to basically pace yourself. I made the mistake. I didn't pace myself, right? And and then the Lord always put me in situations to exemplify certain fruits of the Spirit, right? So so this is just a lesson to basically just, when you're eating, pace yourself, right? It looks bad when you like, if you saw somebody at a buffet, for example, and they were eating constantly and not actually taking the time to chew their food, in their stomach is going to have a hard time breaking that down, because they didn't go through the necessary channels in the process to allow to slow down, chew the food, let the teeth break it down, let it mix in with the saliva, then swallow, right? So now it's actually easier and more digestible on the way down, and now the stomach can actually deal with that properly. But imagine if they took a whole steak and, they were just like cutting, they took the whole thing and they were just trying to swallow it, the stomach will have a very hard time, trying to break all that down. If the food was solid coming all the way down, the person didn't take the time to properly digest, that food coming down. Like, imagine trying to digest a whole bread. You don't take the time to chew it, you'll choke. You see? So, like, you don't spiritually, I'm saying this in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense, you don't want to choke, right? You don't want to vomit, right? So, as a matter of fact, I think this says that somewhere in Proverbs. One second. Is it 24 or 25? I think it's 25, actually. Because one of the things you learn, when you go through the accounts of our forefathers is knowing the you should be able to basically parallel it to your own situations and whatever situations that you go through, so you can get more understanding in regards to what it is that you're going through and how you operate in a righteous manner, right? So this is Proverbs 25 verse 16, and it says, have you found pleasure sweet like honey? Eat only as much as you need, otherwise, being filled excessively, you vomit it, right? So if you found, just take bite-sized chunks, and that was the mistake that I did not, adhere to. I'm just saying this, I made that mistake, right? I'm not gonna be like, brothers, don't do that, and then I'm still doing it, right? I made that mistake, but I've learned the importance of my flesh. My flesh likes to do this, so let me temper myself. Let me examine myself more. Let me actually pace myself this time. There's no rush. You feel me? There's a hunger, but there is no rush at the same time, right? Let me read that. It says, eat only as much as you need, otherwise being filled excessively, you will vomit it, right? Because there's an unsettling in your stomach, right? In the stomach, it's trying to, to digest this stuff, and it's like there's always some kind of unsettlement, right? So, essentially you vomit, right? So, um, let me go here. I guess the last point I pretty much just wanted to hit was basically fruits of the spirit, pretty much. That is something that I've learned to, one. This is Second Peter chapter 1 verse 5, and it says, and besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to your virtue knowledge, and to your knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, right? And that was one of the things, for myself, I had to, pace myself and work on, was temperance. And because, there's a scripture in somewhere in Sirach where it says, not all things are profitable for all men, right? And neither every soul shall have pleasure in everything, to roughly paraphrase, right? And it's not a bad thing to want to be more, well-rounded and studied, but just pace yourself. That's really the point, of this, this particular lesson, right? So it says, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience. Who's it that said? Paul said, "He that striveth for masteries is temperate in all things," right? So, balancing out. If you're that type of person, then maybe okay, uh, um, you do things that's a bit more. You work on, addressing some of your weaknesses, for example, right? You strengthen out. You try to be, a little bit more. Do activities that, that help you to strengthen to strengthen you, that that you pretty much neglected, right? Like for myself, for example, like speaking, like public speaking, I don't really like to do that, but the Lord always put me in situations, and will put you in situations to be able to work on, particular things, so you become a little bit more well-rounded, right? So to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Yahushua Hamashiach. Right. So the point is really to be more, fruitful, right? And then top of that also, if I may add this last point, one of the things that can come about from these books is, um, is essentially being too puffed up. And when you're too puffed up, you can't. And that's one of the things the Lord hates, is pride, right? When you go into Proverbs, you don't want to be too prideful and thinking everything, right? That's why, surrounding yourself with the discourse of like elders, and what I'm saying, like it helps to kind of keep you, and servitude as well. And Yahushua showed us that. So it all boils back to, points back to Yahushua, to servitude really helps you to, basically, remain humble, right? Yahushua said, I'm among them, who serves, right? Not esteeming yourself as somebody, highly, because that's one of the things that can come about, one of the consequences that can come about from the making of many books, right? I'm just speaking from examples and experience, right? So you don't want that. You want to shun that, right? Servitude is really, really important, and the Lord will always put us in situations to exemplify, that. And Yahushua showed us that, when you go into the Gospels, right? Washing the disciples' feet, right? So, this is just something I just thought I was on my mind, and I just thought I would just, share this, sacrifice. That's another part too, being be not conformed to the ways of this world, right? That's a very, very important part, and offering up a sweet smelling sacrifice, right? So I think I've rambled on quite a bit, but I pray and sincerely hope that this lesson was just quick, straight to the point, to this is not a knock to knowing some of, the extra books that pertain into different parts of history. One of my favorites is Nature Knows No Color Line by J.A. Rogers. He's a Jake from, I think, Jamaica, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it goes into the different kingdoms where, Jake ruled, and that's inspiring to know. It is very inspiring, right? You know, but at the same time, okay, just pace yourself, temperance, right? Take time to actually, develop, right? And get familiar with the stories, and understanding who you are and your enemies. Understand, the writings of some of the kings and what they went through and all this kind of stuff. Like, these things are very important because the scriptures talk about, again, as I said before, those things are written aforetime for our learning, right? So, Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.